Hello.
Hey there, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Um, just want to do a quick check here. Mic sounds all right. Speakers sound all right.
Yeah, you sound good to me. Am I sounding okay to you? Levels okay and all that?
Yeah, yeah, you sound just fine.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. I am also going to give you some co-host abilities, so you might want to just try them out and
cool.
see how they go.
All right, I see some stuff here. I see breakout rooms and whiteboards and things I've never seen before. Cool. Is there anything specific I should try?
Share your screen.
Cool.
Because sometimes people on MacBooks have issues with security. So if you've never done it before, we want to get that out of the way.
Yeah, we should be
Okay.
good. We're seeing this, and let's make sure we're seeing enough stuff. Did I see the test there and stuff like that?
Yeah, great. Looks
Sweet.
good. Okay.
Yeah,
So I think we can start in a couple minutes here. It just turned 6. So I'll just kind of do like a basic overview of JavaScript LA, HackBuddy, and then just kind of get into like the particulars of how to like find us and share and all that stuff. And then we'll hand it over to you, Mark.
sounds good.
You
And
doing
I'm
all right
shooting.
though?
Yeah, everything else is good. So I'm shooting for about
Okay.
45 minutes on the presentation. Let's see how long it actually comes in. Um, it's sort of pretty newly formed, but yeah, everything else is good.
Yeah, this looks like a really good topic, and I'm glad Marco reached out to you. So I'm really stoked for this talk. So let me go ahead and share my screen real quick, and let's see here. So does everybody see JavaScript LA HackBuddy, the website?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So basically, the deal is that this is a meetup group that runs pretty much monthly. I've been doing it for the last 10 years. And basically, you can come to our group like every month. Actually, you can join us more than that, but like every month, if you visit us, we have meetups. This today, we're doing testing Vue components with Cypress with Mark Noonan. And then tomorrow or this week, actually, we'll have another meetup with Kintone, who's our constant partner, and they'll be doing a workshop, which is pretty cool. And that'll be on using their API along with Medium API and doing some JavaScript work. So you won't want to miss that. Um, in addition to that, we also have some more stuff down the line. We're doing open source coding, which I'll talk about briefly. Um, I'm going to go back to Team Hack. Team Hack is kind of like our open source GitHub, where if you like the stuff that you see, basically like in a lot of these meetups, you can try to work on some of that with us. We're constantly evolving and building out our team, right? One thing that we're doing together is like studying in groups now. And we're studying things like data structures and algorithms, system design. So if this is something that interests you, reach out to me. I can get you included in some of these groups. If you're just preparing for interviews and stuff like that, I can definitely help you out. Again, that's the whole point of Team Hack, to help you build out, your resume, learn things like React and Vue, Cypress, all kinds of cool stuff. We've got a lot of different projects going on. So definitely check it out. The YouTube channel is always there if you need it for reference. It's youtube.com/hackbuddyorg. And then watch this intro video if you're brand new and you want to get a sense of who I am and what all I do. I also welcome you to connect with me directly on LinkedIn. That's kind of like the easiest way, I think, for a lot of people. So I'll put my name in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me, connect. I try to connect with everybody and just make friends. Really happy to make friends with you. And then finally, we do have a Discord channel, which I'd like to just kind of, keep people aware of. So basically, you can talk to us pretty much like anytime, before and after a meetup. Simplest way is just click on this little banner here, and that should take you over to our invite, and you should be able to join us on Discord. We do use Slack as well, but I think Slack is a little bit more restricted in terms of what we're able to do. So a lot of us just prefer Discord. But if you're a Slack user, feel free to go and do that. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of cool things coming up. So stay tuned. You can follow us on pretty much like your favorite medium, probably Twitter or LinkedIn might be like the best. So if you see an invite from me for HackBuddy, feel free to join that, or directly join the emailing list. So that's my spiel. That's HackBuddy JavaScript LA. Hope you can be a part of our community, and thank you for coming to the meetup today. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Mark. And also, before I do hand it over, I just want to mention, please, we've been growing a lot, and like we're getting bigger, and as part of getting bigger, I expect a few weird people to show up sometimes, and I want to remind everybody of our code of conduct, right? While I don't blatantly go out and say it, if you are disruptive, you will be removed from the group, and you probably won't be allowed to come to a new Zoom meeting. Just so you know, even if you are disruptive, a lot of these videos that we put out pretty much get edited, so you're just wasting your time too if you're trying to make a weird scene. All right, so thank you so much, and let's hand it over to Mark.
All right. So hi everybody, and I am gonna share my screen and we'll kind of get started here. And yeah, let's do that. So I have some slides for this. This is a pretty new talk, so I'm still sort of feeling out exactly the way to talk about these things, but we'll start out with a little bit of context. And I know not everybody on the call might be familiar with Cypress or with component testing in general. So as we go, we're going to get into some examples where if you're not familiar with it, hopefully it will become clear as we talk about it. But yeah, just a little bit about me. I'm a senior engineer at Cypress. So I've actually been working on the topic of component testing at Cypress for the last 6 months or so. Before that, I was an engineer and a team lead at a fleet management company where I worked kind of on the front end there, and we were using Cypress, and we began to use the alpha of Cypress component testing. And I liked it so much, and I ended up talking a lot to the people at Cypress and starting to work there to get to contribute to this feature, which is super cool. I'm a co-organizer at Code for Atlanta, so we're a civic hack group. We do general any project for civic good is fair game. Our meetups are online right now, and they have been for most of the pandemic. But recommend if you're either in the Atlanta area or just curious about what civic tech is, there's a lot of good stuff going on there to check out. And then finally, I'm a program developer at People Making Progress. That's a nonprofit based in Georgia where I was a full-time employee for about 7 years. We work with adults with developmental disabilities, and I'm mostly involved now as their tech support helper person since I stopped working there full-time. But I always like to mention them because it's a huge influence on me, and they're a nonprofit and they need donations. So any chance to mention donations works. This is where I have the slides for this presentation. There's not too much in here that you might want, but I do put some links at the end and stuff like that. So if you want to have the slides or you want to follow along or anything like that, this is the link to use. And I'll put it up again at the end as well. So let's just kind of go through what we'll spend our time doing. I want to start with a brief overview of component testing and end-to-end testing in Cypress. Not spend too much time on it, but just kind of highlight the differences. People are probably a lot more familiar with end-to-end testing for front end. After that, we'll make a component together, and we'll do the testing that we need to do to support making the component and then validating it from the end-to-end side. So that's where we'll look at actually doing the code and where the spec files live and how this all kind of comes together. And I have some recommendations I'll give. I kind of want to give this as an overview of the topic of component testing within Cypress and some sort of guidelines as you get started, because it opens up a world and even other kinds of component testing that people might be doing. I've seen a lot of questions around exactly what to test and how deep to test and whether to shallow mount components and stuff like that. So I have some do's and don'ts that I've been thinking about, and I'll share them here. Some of them depend on a particular testing strategy, so we'll talk about that. And then at the end, I'll try to wrap it up, just kind of summarizing the thoughts about component testing. And I have some more wacky stuff that I'd like to show you that is not really like a part of Cypress. It is things you could do as a user of Cypress. So it's some unofficial experimental things I've been playing around with. And just as a heads up, we're gonna look at this through some in progress work. I have a build of a release of Cypress that's coming up, but it's not out yet. So the user interface will be different than what you can do today in Cypress, but the principles are the same. And like I said, at my old company, we started using the current alpha version of Cypress component testing a while ago. And then there's some stuff we won't talk about. I want to keep this kind of informative and not necessarily get into the weeds on everything that we could be touching. So we're not going to talk about setting up a Vue app. We're not going to talk about setting up component testing because both of these things are super well documented and more great docs are coming for component testing as well. So between that and also everyone's situation is different, it's hard to make a tutorial for setting it up that's really useful use of time. So yeah, we'll be more in an overview mode. So to start out with, Cypress is mostly known for end-to-end testing right now. That's where you write an automated test that knows how to visit a web page, and it will go to a certain URL, and then it will check various things on the page. So we might visit google.com and have the automated test type something into the search box and make sure that when you submit the search box, you get results, something like that. So the URL that you use in sci.visit when you create an end-to-end test is really important. That is what sets up the initial state of the test. What you have to do locally when you're running something to develop with your tests, you have to run the local server with the application and go and visit localhost, port, whatever, to have your test load up the fully running app and assert things about various parts of the page. Component testing is different. So the background is it's been out for a while in alpha. We're in version 9 now, so it's been through a few Cypress versions. And then its main difference is that we use sci.mount, which is a new command to just render a component on its own. It means you don't have to visit a running application. You don't have to go to a URL and maybe click around some stuff and get to a part of the page that you want to test. You can look at the component completely in isolation. You can render it more or less the same way you would in your Vue files and just see it by itself. This means you're going to be able to use props. You're going to be able to use slots. You can mock out other things if you need to. Like your routers or your stores or something, you can provide it the context that the component needs through the API of the component. That's how I would consider the props and slots and events and stuff like that. So this is an equivalent to what people might be doing currently in Jest. That's kind of the most popular way to do this, with the main difference being that you can run your tests in Cypress, which is running in a real browser, and you can debug your tests in the browser instead of looking at the output in the terminal from Jest. So the big thing for me when I came across component testing was that interacting with the DOM and asserting things and commands and the command log that you see in Cypress that we'll look at in a minute, and the browser dev tools and how I can intercept network requests and return like different data for testing, all of that's the same in both types of testing. And that's what really appealed to me about it when I was at a company using Cypress, because when I would stop, when I would work on a component and write tests in Jest or something, there's a little bit different rules there. There's a virtual browser and simulated DOM, and things aren't quite as exactly the same as they are when your users are using your components, but also you're moving between two different testing mindsets. So I won't get too much into that, but the key thing is, aside from visit and mount, most of what you're going to do is going to be really similar. So let's do an example component that we'll work on together. And I'm going to do this in this app. So let me give you a little tour of that app first. Oh, I got to come out of the slide, I guess. It's a different app. So this is very like the Vue app that you get when you just use the Vue CLI to scaffold it. I've added some routes and there's some like new content in here, some behavior. So we do have things that I added for testing purposes to this repo. And there's a lot of experimental fun stuff that I'm trying in this repo. So I'll share it at the end, but it's mostly useful for explaining the difference between the testing types. So yeah, this is a standard Vue app. It's in Vue 3, and we have a new page route here that I just added for this, and we're going to add a component to it. As I go, I'm not certain that I'll see the chat as you ask questions if you have them, but it seems like we're a pretty small group, so please do feel free to ask questions as we go. Some of them I might push to the end if you have real specific things, but a lot of them, it's helpful to me. If you have a question, then I can answer it. Feel free to ask. Okay, so let's get started here. Let's take a tiny tour of the code base. That's the application. So the structure of the code. Yeah, this test can be saved. The structure of the code is an SRC folder with lots of components in it. The components have tests living right beside them. So every component has a test. Some of them are JSX, some of them are not. That's just I don't know why I didn't make them all the same, but every component has a test living alongside it. And then we still have the old Cypress end-to-end folder in the Cypress folder with end-to-end tests that visit pages. So this is an example of a test that goes and visits the new page. And I think we have that running, so let's take a look at it. Yeah, this is it. So I'm just gonna zoom in a little bit and refresh. Yeah, that works. So this is a standard Cypress test that you might be used to doing. Visit/new page changes the URL up here. You can see as I click around, the URL is changing up here. So we're definitely an end-to-end land being a user. And to start with, we can add an assertion here. We can say sci.contains new page. And we want it to have this active state. I want to inspect it here and use the tools to see exactly what we would do about that. Yeah, there's an active class on the list item. So yeah, not actually going to get sidetracked by that. Let's just leave it at the new page part should be visible. The idea here is that this represents any test you might want to do. We're going to say, cool, expected this link to be visible. Perfect. We're going to say that an end-to-end test probably is checking stuff like this. And now let's make a new component that I've decided to call the fancy text component. I'm going to double check in Chrome. Let's take a look at, yeah, this should now be able to be on its own. Describe what we're going to do before we get stuck in. So we have 3 different kinds of tests that we're going to touch as we work on this. To make the component itself, we will create a component and a component test, and we'll use the component test to validate what we're doing. Michael, I see your question. I think we can use like an assertion like has CSS, but it's on the wrapper LI, and I just didn't want to spend time like writing a detailed test because it's not the focus of what we're talking about. So we have a few ways that we could check the CSS of the element. Let's see. All right, so one component test will validate it. One component test will check the use of it by a parent component. And that's going to be a lot more minimal than the root component test, that one that actually goes alongside the component itself. We'll talk about the difference between those two. And then finally, we'll add to our end-to-end test that we just looked at to also get a sense that this component is doing what we expect. And the reason to look at these 3 layers is that sometimes, especially with multiple nested components, it can be sort of confusing. What should we bother testing where? And it feels like we end up with a lot of repetition, or even worse, we have near repetition between different levels of testing, but it's not quite the same. So if you were to delete one test, like you might lose some part of the coverage. It's difficult to like sort it out later. So if you have a strategy like this that we're going to talk about, it can help avoid needless duplication or near duplication. So let's just make our component. We know it's going to live here, but we're not going to start with it on the page. We're going to start with it in a component test. Which means I'm going to switch Cypress over to component testing mode, let it start up again. I'm going to make us a new component test, or new component file here. So in components, let's just copy the simplest one that's in here, which is a list item component. And I'm going to take out everything about it. It's just an empty template. I guess we got to have something in there. So we're going to put a p tag with some content in it. And change the name, fancy text. I fixed this example because I wanted something simple enough to talk about. So this is not a practical component you might really make, but I hope it'll illustrate the issues that we want to talk about. So fancy text.vue is our component. It's not being used anywhere. It's not being rendered anywhere. I'm going to close all the other stuff that I happen to have open right now and grab the path of this. So now that component exists, I can create a component spec here that will end up in the right place. It's yelling at me because .vue is not a valid test file name. That's true. We want to call this .sci.jsx and create the spec. Cool. So it's created an empty spec for me, or almost empty, that now lives beside my component. And this is the content that it made for me. So I'm going to run that spec, and we'll see we have an error. Oh, it's complaining about the linting that I just changed. All right, not too worried about that. Let's fix that linting. Ooh, that's super annoying. Yeah, this still works. All right. See if we revert this file. We may get some other errors from the linter, but that's not actually going to be a big problem. Let's revert that. And let's reopen Cypress. Cool. So we'll pick component testing and we will go through. Great. And we have, let's see. We made our fancy text. There it is. Cool. So now we're back to what we should have been earlier without that package.json stuff. We have a test that is just doing a playground that doesn't do anything. So inside of it, we have errors now because I've removed the linter, but that's fine. Let's ignore those so we can just kind of work around them. And we can look at what sci.mount is going to do. So first of all, we need to import fancy text from right there where it is and mount it. So let's just let this playground test run again. Cool. So we see content. So that's enough to get our test running the component. We can change the content here. Let's make it actually a little bit more fancy. And we see it. So one thing I would like to do is start changing some stuff in our tests. Let's put these side by side. Here it is a little bit. So let's start with what we have right now, which is we're mounting it with no props of any kind. We're going to say it shows default content with no props. So it doesn't even have props defined in here. So there's nothing really to do. And we have default content up here. Let's make that more explicit. Cool. And we will check for that in here. Sci.contains default content. Let's also say it should be a p tag. In fact, I'm going to change my mind about this. I want this to be a h1. I want this to be something that we might use for a title, and that we're going to say, the accessibility matters, the element matters. And in the component test, we're really going to hammer that we get exactly the right output that we expect, so that we have somewhere that will definitely fail. And later down the line, end-to-end tests might not have to be so specific about some of these details. They often aren't anyway, and they kind of fall through the cracks. So that's a detail I would like to change. Let's just say it's going to be a H1. And let's see what our test is doing. Cool. So default content with no props. Now, typically, this would rerun by itself. But like I said, this is an in-progress build, so I'm not going to sweat what's like not automatically rerunning. Let's just move forward with the testing. And then let's test something that doesn't exist yet. Shows custom content with custom content. Let's just call it content prop. Let's test one other thing. I want these little squiggles. These are what makes it fancy in my mind. This is what I've decided constitutes fancy text, is we have this little tilde here. So if we put that here, and we're going to say, yeah, let's map this here with JSX. We're going to give it a content prop. And we're going to say content equals custom. And our expectation would be that that prop would work. And if it was working, we would get something like this. And let's see how that goes. So can't find custom content. It's not in the H1. It still says default content here, which makes sense. We didn't set up a prop yet. And so this is like very literal test-driven development style. Make the thing, assert the thing before you even try to add it, and then get it pass, like the red-green refactor pattern. Let's add this prop here. I don't know in real life how many people are doing that with Vue components, but it's possible when you have tests like this that are like super focused. So let's look at, yeah, we decided to call this content. And I'm going to say type string, and we're going to render the content in here. And what we should see is one test will be passing now, and the other test will be failing. So we'll rerun this. This default content test is failing now, but the custom content says, yeah, we found the custom content. And so I think one thing to use these for is they run pretty quick. They're pretty small because it's just this one component. So as you touch something to fix one test, it's pretty quick to find out if you broke something somewhere else. So now I'm going to change this to have default. And this value in here will be, what is it, default content. So at this point, everything should be passing. When there's no props, we get that. We get custom, and we can tell, we're passing in a string that does not have these extra tildes before and after. So we can tell the component itself is doing the transformation to make it look this way. And so that's the basic functioning of this component, taken care of. So now the question is, well, this is supposed to go in a web page and be seen by a user. So we have to figure out where this is going to get used and what do we bother testing there. And then also figure out the end-to-end piece of a user visits the application. When are they supposed to see this? So looking at the other places we might want to use this, we've got the list of other specs here. I'm going to add it to the new page component. So all these views, these routes, are just checking they're just Vue components. So they can have their own like deep component tests that check everything there as well. We're not even at the end-to-end test level yet. But we do have a failing check here on the new page end-to-end test. So let's take a look at that. Might have been left over from when I was oh, it's a component test. Yeah, it's left over from the new page component test. Here we go. So we're saying sci.dot contains hello, but we don't have the component in there that would actually render that yet. And at this point, we're in a parent component. And I think this is the way to write these types of assertions in the parent component. And I want to highlight this in terms of other things that I've seen people do and seen people ask about. So one question that's come to me a couple of times is around like rendering child components or not, and perhaps checking, that it received a prop with name content and it had a certain value to check if the new page component is doing what it's supposed to do to use its direct child components. Like we want to make sure that a parent component is using its children correctly, so we reach the appropriate expected states. And the way that I think to do that is purely through the minimal user-facing thing you can check that will prove that to you. We don't have to repeat what we did in the individual component test. We don't have to confirm it's a H1 if we're already checking that here. But we do want to know that new page did actually render this content somehow. So we're just checking, does the content exist? And so since we already have a failing test, let's go to the new page component itself and get our parent component test in there. So here we're going to import that component again. Does that work? Sweet. Add it down here. And we'll use it inside this empty wrapper. So at this point, we're going to have just clean it up like this and pass some content that should start to pass the test. We'll put in the word hello that matches what our test is expecting. Rerun the component test. Now it's passing. And if we go back to the app itself, it's showing this now because we've done it, right? We've put it in this /new page Vue component that renders it. We haven't messed with anything else. Everything still works. So our application has been changed now. Like we've done the ticket. If we had a ticket to do this work, we've completed it. We've made a change to the application. But we don't have a user-facing end-to-end test yet. And there's some judgment involved in whether you need one for every possible state. Component tests can be really exhaustive. They should check everything that a component is supposed to be able to do from a user perspective. And how does it react to all of its props and the combinations of props and everything that are like unique things it's supposed to do. And then end-to-end tests tend to be a little bit more focused on a user's progression through the application. And they may not check every detail or force every component into every state. So there's a little bit of judgment required on what we end up doing. Well, let's add it for the sake of demonstrating it. So we'll come back over to the end-to-end test. And we will allow it to bring us back to new page. And we can see that new page is this visit that we already looked at in the beginning. So contains new page should be visible. Let's ignore these for a second. And let's go forward with now a very similar thing. We can just write in here sci.contains hello. And at this point, these two things are the same, right? Let's do the expected before and after character. At this point, the end-to-end test and the page level component test are the same. But in theory, there are things that in the context of the entire page could break something that are not present when it's just the component test itself. And an example of that would be if on this page, let's add an assertion here that it should be visible. I do that a lot. if on this, oh, we have people joining. All right. On this page, we wanted to make this assertion. It's passing, it's visible, but it's possible that this would be covered by something else, and then we'd have a failing test, like a modal in the application or something like that. So in the simple example, we don't have a particular difference to watch out for. But for more general applications, there is increased risk as you go up the layers. There's increased risk that something else about what you're testing will interfere with the internal components. So the value of having coverage at the end-to-end level, even though you have component tests for something, is that you can confirm you're still passing, even if there's potential for modals or other things to pop up and block content, or for like third-party scripts to be running that change the DOM or mess with what you've got there. So there's a lot of considerations that go into, okay, making this a valid end-to-end test. And for me, if you find yourself repeating things across different testing types, especially across different layers, they should be like fairly light repetition like this, or because everything is running in Cypress anyway, you're able to make custom commands for repeated things, or just make JavaScript functions that run repeated things often if they're complicated. So that's what I'd suggest. And then this is our 3 tests done. So one thing we can do to kind of validate what's going on is we can break this. Let's see if I break this content prop. Just change the spelling. When this test runs, this one's failing already. But if we weren't looking at this test, if we were looking at other tests, they wouldn't be failing. If we just made this change and pushed it up to CI, we could let it run and see the tests failing. But what we really get from the component test is later on, there'll be precision about the components that were affected by this change and what the change was, which means if I had this open, I could have it yell at me right away that I broke the name of a prop. And the name of a prop is part of the interface that every other component who consumes this one depends on. So the added coverage of the prop name tells us side by side as we're developing this, yeah, there it reran properly. We learn side by side that we're passing things or not. Likewise, if I change the default content and break that, we learn right away this one failed. So I'm going to switch back to the slides for a minute and just kind of talk through some of the details of this. Let's move some of these desktops out. Oh, that's right. They went over here. Cool. So that's the 3 levels of testing that I wanted to show as like an intro. And I think that's a kind of good amount of time to stop at. The 3 places where I would want to check this. Then it's a judgment call. If you want to check every parent using their child components directly, you still want to find the minimum way to do that. So now we get to the do's and don'ts. And if you're like me, when you see these words, you're hearing them in a very specific trailer voice. So this is what I got. In a world where every component has a test, we can have nice do's and don'ts and reduce duplication. Some of what I'm about to suggest here does rely on having a structure where your components do all have tests. If you're mixing and matching and some do and some don't, it's a little bit harder to be precise about exactly which one each should cover, which layers each test should cover. And a good example of this is components that have multiple child components that are really only there to serve the main component. Sometimes you can kind of group those together and just test them through their like main parent. But yeah, here's some good component test do's. We set up state using the API of the component under test. That means we're passing in a prop. We're not necessarily depending on anything external to the test that would provide what the component needs. Sometimes you might stub a network request if a component talks to the network and needs to get a user object or something. You can do that. But as much as possible, we would use the component's own API. So we get that coverage we just looked at with something like a prop name changing. We want to be using all the prop names in the component test, and we get some benefit from that. So we're also, this can be in a better, yeah. We're also asserting the expected content that's directly owned by the component. So we didn't get too far into this, but what's most important in a component test is the things that that component itself renders. The actual HTML in the component is what it's responsible for, and it may call child components that call other child components. And we do want to know that it's using them correctly in some way that's valid. But the actual like details of, from accessibility point of view, what elements are they? What are the things going on in the component? We should be testing the things it directly renders as its own HTML. As much as possible, we should use the user's perspective and test the impact of changing a prop on what's user-facing, test the actions a user can do. It's really tempting, especially if user-focused testing is harder to do, depending on how you're writing component tests. It's really tempting to test internal methods and test like a method on a Vue component, or unit test the computed properties and stuff like that. That is, I would say, like not as useful, because those are kind of private internal things to the component. And what we really want to know is, in the browser, as a user's looking at it, is it returning the right output for this set of inputs? So if a method is particularly complicated internally or something, it might be worth extracting and unit testing by itself. But in most cases, we're going to render the component. We have access to what the user sees, so we should be able to use that to determine if it's behaving correctly. That's a little more important than the behavior of internal methods if they don't actually like get referenced in the template and do what they're supposed to do. So yeah, user-facing stuff as much as possible. Assert that the expected events are emitted. We didn't get a good example of this, but we can put a click handler or something on a component. We can emit other events from the component and spy on them in the component test to make sure that they get called. And this is good because, just like prop names, other components depend upon events being emitted with a certain name. Yeah, we mentioned this. Assert that direct child components behave as expected, using the minimum possible assertions to do that. So we shouldn't look at, like, try to get the Vue instance of a child component from a parent and inspect like its prop values or something. We should just go, okay, I'm using a single component. It's supposed to pass a value to a child component, and that child component is supposed to do something with that value. So I'm going to look in the DOM as a user and see that the child component did use that value. But then also, here's where I'm going to stop. I'm not going to go to the child of the child, or the grandchild of the child, or the great-grandchild. Even though that stuff is probably available, inner layers of component testing at those components are going to cover it, and we don't have to assert everything everywhere if we're structured in a way that makes sense. The other thing we would like to cover is all the variations or states of a component. So we just had one component with one state, but we could have that be an alert that has a success, a fail, an error, warning states. One of the great things about component testing is you can easily set up each state of your component and make assertions about it, maybe take screenshots or something to validate the visual state. But you can use the component's props to set that up. So here are some don'ts. Right, we've covered this already. Don't check prop names and values and that type of state of a component instance that's a child component. It's not user-facing, and it's a lot more work, and it's a lot more framework specific. So user-facing tests are very agnostic to the framework. A lot of the code that is the same between an end-to-end test and a component test is driven by Cypress commands and assertions, and those are not component specific. So you can migrate, for example, from React to Vue using a huge amount of shared stuff and just changing the way, like if you're doing one-to-one, just change how your component mounts. The mounting command for React and Vue is a little different. But the bulk of your tests could remain the same if you're doing a migration like that, so that you can create new components that match the behavior of the old components. Okay, so don't test content that's not directly rendered by the component or that's rendered by a direct child. This is where people drift into covering too much, I would say, and repeating or close to repeating assertions. And then this is reinforcement of that. Do not duplicate assertions between the layers, except in the minimal way that works. And if those duplications become really complicated, a command like, okay, validate the header, like that can be a custom command that you run in multiple scenarios, like you might already be doing for end-to-end testing. So that's the gist. And don't test internal methods by name, test their user-facing effects. So I do have a summary. Component tests are neat, but also this is a good time to pause and ask if there are any questions or anything that popped up that I can address. VJ, do people have permission to just unmute themselves and talk, or do we do it?
Of course.
Yeah.
So anybody here can pretty much like ask a question. You can also do it in the chat if you want. I'll be monitoring the chat. I am doing that anyway. And so if a question comes from there, I can also ask it as well.
Cool. All right, and then I'll just I'll keep going with the summary then. So why I think component tests are neat. This is kind of where I've come around to using them, and what I've noticed when using them at work is we get a single place to specify all of a component's behavior. So if I want to know, do we have a state for something already? I can look at the component's test and look at all the things it's checking, and I can go, okay, this is the required behavior of this component. That's super useful to me. As you do it, you have to use the props and slots of a component to get it into the right state. So you end up kind of doing that because it's necessary, because I'm developing and I want to see the component on its own. So I'm going to use the props this way. But then you get this free validation of the prop names over time aren't changing. We're not breaking other components. This is really important if you have like a design system where the package that your components live in is not necessarily the same as another repo that might be importing your components and using them. So the end-to-end test or the other test that would fail because we changed prop names and we didn't notice, that test that would fail might not be part of the same suite that the component tests are covering. So those people using the component might not know that that the change in your prop names is what's caused a failure in their end-to-end tests after they upgrade to the latest version of your components. So especially in that situation, documented API would really, really catch those things before they go on to the next consumers of the components. I have found that writing component tests makes the components I write a little bit more isolated. I have depended more on props and events and less on global state, Vuex, or Pinia. I've depended a little bit less on the router as well, partly because it's easy to write a component and just give it some props and get it to do all of the things it needs to do, and not have to worry about mocking those other things. So it puts a little bit of resistance towards depending on a router, depending on global state. And I find that's usually good because often components don't really need that. And our patterns work just fine with internal component state. So for the components that do need it, we can mock all those things in component tests. But if we're starting out from an empty page that we're going to render the blank component in, it's really nice to have the isolation. And it's great when it's time to delete a component. You look at the component test, you understand what it's doing, and it's already kind of unpackaged from the other global things it might be hooking into. So we really know it's not providing data that are being used by downstream components, and it's not accessing stuff that we would also have to know to delete that is like global state that's only used by a couple of components. So really like that aspect of it. end-to-end tests written by other people can focus more on user flows and not component correctness. So what I've noticed is, depending on the company, sometimes the front-end developers are writing the end-to-end tests, and sometimes it's a separate like quality team. And so the understanding of what's the correct markup, especially for a component, what's the right HTML element for the accessibility needs of this component in a certain context. You know that when you're the front-end developer working in the component. You can put that into your component test so that something will fail if the component is broken that way. But end-to-end tests can be written by other people in the company, but also later by new people working on different features that happen to consume the components you've written. And every end-to-end test is not going to check it's a real link. It's not going to check this button's a real button. It's often going to use data attributes to select elements and click them and do things that like work for a certain user, but don't test keyboard behavior or don't test screen reader accessibility. But if those things are covered in the component test level, we can have really good confidence that we're not accidentally breaking them. And we can chill out a little bit about the things that are responsibilities for end-to-end tests as they go through the user actions. So I still like having accessibility first in my end-to-end tests right now, but I know that if someone comes along later and rewrote all of my tests to use a data attribute and not check that it was a real button, it would be okay because we would have still got the component test that asserts those things that matter to me when I'm developing a component. I really, really like the workflow and the kind of what we saw of clicking between Cypress and the editor. I really like the experience of developing in isolation and the help you get by going, okay, I'm just going to write a new it block that tests a different state. I'm going to write a new it block that tests a different state. So I can actually set them up one by one and then look at my designs in Figma or whatever and build it to match that design, and then switch to the next state and then build it to match that design. And so I feel like the test is kind of helping me do the work of making the component, and that's one sort of value. But then the artifact I have left over of the test itself is a complete documentation of the component's behavior and what it's supposed to do and not do. And then it also is like insurance against unintended changes coming down the road that somebody else might introduce that change the behavior in a way we don't want. So I have learned to really like having one test per component and starting working in the workflow I just showed here. It took me a little while to come around to it. I used to develop everything kind of in the application, and instead of even using a test for it, I would use the application itself to develop it. That led to components that were a little bit more interdependent on other parts of the app because they were always available. And it led to components that sometimes didn't work so well when they got reused in a different part of the apps I was working on. So this has been kind of the guts of the talk. I do have, the boiled egg and a sock thing. This is something I heard from my Russian doctor years ago when I had an issue with my eye. She said, "You're going to boil a sock. You're going to boil an egg. You're going to boil an egg, and you're gonna get a wet sock, dip it in water, and that's your compress. That's your heat pad for your eye." And she said it's going to last you for half an hour. The egg will stay hot for ages. It'll be your thing. I want you to do that, for 20 minutes, 4 hours, something like this. And she said, and then when you're done, you have a boiled egg. You have a protein snack you can have. And she's like, so you get two things in one here. It's kind of how I felt about that as I wrote this part of the presentation. So this is where these slides are if you want to refer to them. And these are some resources that are, just useful things if you want to learn more about component testing. I have this branch that we wrote our tests in here. So our HackBuddy branch. Yeah, let's save this stuff. Might fix the lint on, but if anybody wants to experiment with this and check it out, feel free. The rest of this repo is the sort of speculative stuff that I debated showing here. I think we have a minute. So I mentioned custom commands and having a test for each component. In this repo, we have a test for each component. And one of the things that we do here that is a totally, users can do this by writing their own custom commands to do this. Let's take a look at the hello list component. This checks a lot of things in here. And we can see it's logging validate hello list, validate the item. I guess it's rerunning as we do this, but it's logging a lot of stuff as we work. And this validate little helper here is just a custom log that I wrote. And one of the things I like about this is that it's a way of a sort of teaching the difference or not difference between component tests and end-to-end tests. So if we look at, let's switch to end-to-end. And then we'll look at some code. If we look at this app end-to-end test, the one that goes to the home page, this is going to do a bunch of assertions. This is quite a long test. It's checking every link and every piece of functionality on the page. It logged in for us. It checked some stuff. So it ends up doing about 100 things. This is way overkill. This is just exploring like the kind of idea that we could do with this kind of pattern. Because when we go and look at the spec itself, we still have this because we removed the linter. I will definitely fix that and push that to the branch. But we have a describe block. We have a couple of calls to a custom command called validate. And then here we have validate the loading state and then validate the app. And so what's going on here is that because the user-facing stuff, the DOM that we're clicking on, because all of that stuff is actually the same between component testing and end-to-end testing, you can really Frankenstein together some weird stuff that exists and is shared between component tests and end-to-end tests because it's the same DOM that we're checking. So this repo, again, totally unofficial, not a part of Cypress, just a thing I wrote with a custom command. This repo is full of this type of command that is checking the default render state of the app. This is how that end-to-end test has those 300 assertions in it. Because it's itself calling other little validators and it's checking the things it's responsible for, which are these images and things that are rendered by the component. This is the directly rendered DOM. And then it's calling these other validators because those other internal parts of it know how to check themselves as well. And what it means is inside the component tests, we have the header bar, which also calls that validate function that lives in here. And so the main difference between the like root app test is mount and then validate. All of the other commands, the other 300-ish commands are all exactly the same if we want them to be. But it's just mount versus visit. And here we do provide a router and stub more stuff because we're way up at the top level. But I think that that's neat for two reasons. One, it shows the ability to sometimes reuse code. I don't recommend this as a pattern. This is just like a way to make it clear that mount and visit are the main differences. But when you need to, you can step into this pattern. And so that's one reason to like this for me, but also, yeah, just as an educational thing of you actually can completely see mount and visit as being the main difference. And you get all the other stuff you usually get with Cypress when you do the component tests as well. So yeah, that is about it. Thank you for kind of bearing with me on the talk. I think a few things went a little awry, but mostly feel like hit the points I wanted to hit. And let's look at questions. I'm going to stop sharing for this.
So you have a question in the chat from Christopher Gomez. He says it sounds like focusing on the component's independence from the app. If you will, you can make it so the component has limited reasons to change, and there's less knock-on effect to your component when the app is consuming the component that needs to change.
Yeah,
So,
I think that that's a true point. There's like you're controlling a lot of what's allowed to affect the components, and that that binding to other things that might cause it to change sometimes happens accidentally when you write your components in place in the app. Sometimes it's just like, okay, I have this available, so I can pass it in. But then later it's less reusable because you rely on having something passed in that just coincidentally the original parent would have had access to, or that came out of like local storage that was set by a different component, or depends upon the URL having a specific thing. So yeah, in component testing, like it really nudged me to write simpler components. And when I couldn't make them simple for the test, it gave me the friction of, why can't I make it simple? Why do we actually, like, is there a reason that we need to put this thing in global state and I have to mock Vuex? And so that kind of is a useful aspect of having explicit component testing as well, no matter how you do it.
I was just going to ask, alongside some of these questions. So just from my understanding, is Cypress pretty good at both doing what Jest already does and then, doing the end-to-end testing as well? Is that kind of what you're saying so far with this talk?
Yeah, so the end-to-end testing is what Cypress has been doing for years, and has become really known for. And then component testing was kind of ideated a couple of years ago before I joined, and became an alpha last year. And so the upcoming version of Cypress, which is, it's not announced yet when exactly it's going to be released, but that's the UI that we were just looking at. That is going to include component testing kind of side by side with end-to-end testing. So it's more of a direct sibling. And I feel like that's going to expose more people to the fact that it's there. And maybe there's some advantages, not just to having the real browser, but to having the same tool to do end-to-end testing and component testing, and not having to learn either Jest or something else, and switch mental models when you go from, if anybody here has written Vue tests using Vue test utils in Jest, there's often a period where you need to await the next tick from Vue, because you don't have a automatic built-in waiting in a real browser. And it was a huge relief to me when I didn't have to await next tick anymore. And my component test or unit test didn't have to know that it was a Vue app as much. I was always puzzled, and it would make people really mad when their test wasn't working and they would ask me, and I'd be like, oh, you have to await the next tick of the Vue application before you check the output of the function. And especially at a full stack place where there was a lot of backend devs contributing to the front end every now and then, they were just super frustrated. So at that company, everybody was real happy to move forward to using Cypress for both. But I think it's case by case. People are going to decide what works for them.
Yeah. And I was talking to somebody this, week, I guess, like, who was just kind of trying to understand, like, what are the better ways to do testing, modern testing, because, a lot of times, like, too, when you work in big companies, they have issues with, there's so much stuff to kind of like keep track of, I think, for tests. And then, like you said, there's different teams that write different tests. Like, what is your vision of a good like testing framework for a company, sort of like at scale, right? Like, what should they be doing, or what's like, just if you
Yeah,
take out points from your slides, maybe like, or recap, that might be also pretty good.
sure. Yeah, I think like in the broad sense, I like it the more like close to development the tests are written. So I like it if end-to-end tests are written as new features are developed and are written by developers taking responsibility for that. And I haven't been many places where a separate team actually does write the end-to-end tests, but I know there are QA engineers where that's their main focus. So yeah, my experience has been, developers would create them as they're creating new components and like closing stories. You would make an end-to-end test that addresses the story. I think that the model that I've settled on is definitely that component tests are more exhaustive about checking everything. I think a lot of people have end-to-end tests right now that are sort of component driven, in that their job is to visit a page and click 10 things and then open a form and test the form in one way, and then go back to it and test the form in another way. And maybe log in as a different user who's supposed to have different fields or something like that. And sort of the test is doing a lot of work to set up the state. That's where I think a component test that exhaustively checks all the expected variations of the form is a really good one to put around that form itself. And then your end-to-end tests are going to be more focused on particular user journeys that you're invested in. It might be, I don't know where this started where I first heard this, like from Chris Fritz possibly, or Kent C. Dodds, but the test of like in end-to-end land, can people log in and can people give us money? Like those are the important things that end-to-end tests must definitely cover. We must completely know that we can get paid. The order forms work. The credit card applications work. That's the like extremely important thing to test, and that users can log into the application. And then the investment in end-to-end is around what other things are users supposed to be able to do and how important are those particular paths. And it's very difficult to be totally exhaustive in end-to-end tests of every possible scenario. But in component tests, the realm of possibilities is a lot smaller. So I think you can legitimately document your entire behavior of your component if you want to in a component spec.
Awesome. Does anybody have questions here? Feel free to jump in. I just want to make sure I'm not hogging the question space.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a note to, I guess, like end-to-end testing, for example. For my case, like in my company, we were like just doing a drop down search for gender, and we didn't really think like on a field we had required, and we just had it in our back end as a required field, but then in our front end we had it as optional. So like we didn't really test our end-to-end testing. In that case, we were only doing like our like unit testing, which was kind of like one thing that we realize now coming like into soon, like releasing our product. It's like we need to make sure that we're catching those component testing in those cases.
Yeah, it's a good point. I haven't like addressed really, the implications of like backend unit testing, where you're comfortable that this does require it and this does error or something if you don't have the field in there. But yeah, from the front end side, the component doesn't have an option or prop to be required, and the UI doesn't present it that way.
It's really interesting. Like even for me, like I'm not using Vue at the moment, but like in TypeScript, when you're using Prisma, it's like you can set the field as optional or required, and then it's like you're going through your your code first schema, then into your GraphQL, setting up the schema shape, and then from the front end, for us we're using Yup, so it's like having that set form component as a drop down list for gender. I guess we didn't really think of that edge case of like someone could just fill in the form and then fill it in as like they don't want to set their gender at all. It's like
I think it's relatively common that might happen. And I'm curious, what is the outcome of that if they successfully submit the form?
So in our like on our front end it would be fine, but then as they're sending the request to the back end through the API into the service, we were just getting an error because Prisma was like, this is a required field. So you needed to create that field as optional in the back end in order for it to fully successfully submit that kind of transaction, that CRUD.
Those rules are hard to discover. It reminds me of a form I worked on where the dependency like that, there was a hard dependency on like character length or something, but that dependency was not on the server that received the form or on the database that stored it. It later gets transmitted to another thing that processes applications. And that thing was ancient and could only handle usernames of 30 characters. And so that requirement didn't filter to any of the other layers. But then this is at an agency I worked at. When we did figure out that's why these forms were sometimes failing, we could process that requirement into a user story, and as a natural extension of that user story in a ticket, be expected to write a test that covered that we did fix the form to prevent this from the front end. And even though there was no error anywhere until downstream later, a third service receives the data.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of like, I've definitely come to rely on something is described in a user story, we implement it. We should test that we did that thing so we don't regress. And it's clear that everything is intentional. Like I try to write semantic HTML. I care that we don't come along and replace my buttons with divs. Not
Yeah.
every developer cares about those things, but if I can put that into a component test at the time that I write it, it's a little bit more resistance to changing the HTML in ways that would affect, assistive technology or something.
Absolutely. And I think like having ultimately, set buttons as components, so you don't have, new developers coming in and setting, various components with different styling and hover effects. That's always a key thing that I find. Like when you go from components into that, you can reduce so much your testing errors, and especially end to end in that case.
Yeah, when you start to see repeated stuff, if you're leaning heavily into the component system, you can break up pretty small things. I've been surprised from when I started working in Vue and in similar stuff, how small like things like links become components, things like checkboxes become components. And I would have thought those were so small that they didn't need to be their own component. But then suddenly you want to reuse them and keep all the work you did to make them right in the first place. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions? I see one from Christopher Gomez, and he's just saying he appreciates the showing of the component versus E2E because he sees a lot of teams start doing one and then treating it like their only hammer.
Yeah, I can relate to wanting to only use one. I would have I joined a team that was using Jest heavily, so I participated in using Jest, but I was so used to doing end-to-end tests only that I would have even chose to keep doing that if it was convenient. But at that company, it was quite an ordeal to start up the application, and we wanted the precision of if something fails, let's find out quickly in the component test results. I do agree, though, there's reasons that it's harder to switch mental models between two different types of testing, and then component tests can get overburdened if you are using Jest heavily. You can run into problems that you're only having because of JS DOM and the simulated browser environment. So you're having to learn and deal with this whole little extra world because you want to write really sophisticated component tests. And if you are able to do that successfully and you don't have an end-to-end test and everything's wired up, like you can certainly, like you said, Christopher, use it like your only hammer and like not try to especially have all this what feels like repetition. And it felt like repetition to me as well as we were doing component and end-to-end testing for a while. It took me a little while to come around to understanding, okay, so the different context and different risks at different layers of our component tests and our end-to-end tests justify repeating certain things a little bit because we may have introduced something at a higher level that does actually break, that wouldn't break in a component test. So I think there's some valid reuse of assertions in between both. But it does feel weird if you start doing it and you feel like you're repeating yourself a lot. I could see why teams would decide to lean on one or the other like too much.
So one other question for you that I just kind of was thinking about, in larger companies where they have things like flow regressions, do you feel like Cypress can help kind of eliminate a lot of that? If the team starts adopting like end-to-end testing, what would be kind of like a good like way for like a manager or somebody to kind of empower their teams to be able to adopt better E2E automated testings?
It's interesting. I haven't. I found different kind of perspectives depending on where I've worked. So at an agency, clients did not care if we had testing or not most of the time. We had one client I remember having that wanted automated tests for certain parts of their application. But it was a little bit harder to get them done, except like I wanted them for my own comfort of long running projects. Our clients were with us for years at a time. So I wanted to have tests for ourselves to be comfortable that our own work was not regressing. But I found like Cypress appealing to use, and I didn't really need to be sold on it. The education around the end-to-end testing in Cypress was pretty good. So as I was working there, I would find myself writing tests for various reasons. I don't know exactly at the manager level how you force your team to use a particular tool. I don't think it's a good idea. I think that the need for end-to-end testing is clear, and that teams need to look at the whole context of what they want to get out of their end-to-end tests, and who their users are and what devices they're using and what kind of reporting they need. So Cypress has a dashboard that's super useful as a paid product, not the open source test runner, super useful for enterprise companies. You get all sorts of parallelization and insights into flaky tests and reporting that like companies might pick Cypress from a management level because of the dashboard's potential and their desire as a manager to have insight into what parts of the tests need attention. But you generally like, I would not like a developer, as a developer, I wouldn't like my manager to tell me, hey, we're going to write some tests. We're using this framework. You have no choice. I would probably encourage the manager to tell the team to do a little spike into it and try some tools and break down their needs.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you on the spike. Got another question here for Michael. Let's see here. One challenge we're facing is that a lot of our backend logic is stored in stored procedures, some of which involve multiple databases. We have an SQL script that we pass around to help seed information. Do you have any resources or guidelines on how Cypress could possibly execute this script?
Not off of the top of my head. I have definitely seen in some of our example stuff, like we have side.task that can execute like something in Node. And that sounds like a pretty specific question that I don't have much experience in. But Michael, I would be happy to sort of get with you on the Discord or follow up afterwards and try to connect you to people in the developer experience who know kind of that world a little better than me. So I don't have any gut feeling on what the thing to do to seed that is, but I have seen us do a simplified version of that where we're like seeding a local thing in between tests that might just be like a flat file, but same principle. So yeah, I don't know a lot about stored procedures. I haven't had to use them and don't want to lead you down the wrong path.
Yeah, just wanted to say thanks real quick. But yeah, we're basically migrating. I think the app that we currently work, like, our app is just so old, and that's where it started with. And basically we seed like literal transactions. We're like an invoicing app. And yeah, it's kind of funny when we do this, we just seed it just to like match and categorize transactions. But no, I would definitely like that. That would definitely being connected to those resources would probably really be helpful.
Yeah, we have, let me grab the link to our Discord and put it in the chat because I'm in there, and it's where I ran into the people that I ended up working with on the team. So yeah, here we go. Here's the link.
So Mark, can you put the links for the other things that you shared from your slides? Or if it's not too cumbersome, just put the slide link itself and I can grab those links afterwards.
Yeah, I can put that. It's a small link.
Especially the GitHub, because like for somebody like myself, and I'm sure other people might agree, just want to like kind of have a resource to look at, anytime I want to look at some of these end-to-end tests, just kind of like see something else written so I can reference it.
We're going to have, let me grab the link to the slides, which has this at the end of it. What did I call it? bit.ly/hackbuddymark. So there's a really thorough reference app that I'm going to add to this called the Cypress Real World Application. Let me find resume it. Here we go. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. That is a much more, I would say, ready to teach you Cypress things application. Because it was developed specifically for that reason. Whereas I kind of wanted to share like what we had done on the call specifically, but I will share a couple of other resources and I'll add these to my slideshow as well, because we just launched learn.cypress.io like less than a month ago, which is a free course that has a whole lot of getting started information to learn more about automated testing in general, a basic to-do application that we can write tests against. So I haven't been through it myself, but I think it's awesome that we're providing one of these courses like directly from us with the examples that we think are valid and the practices that we think are good. Yeah, I should immediately put that in the slides. It was so new that I forgot it existed. It just came out. So yeah, let's find this.
Excellent. Yeah, and I'm just starting to like click on some of these myself and just check out the resources. So yeah, absolutely, this is great.
Yeah, and that there's a Vue article I linked there that's specifically based on the current version of Cypress that you can install now. Like you would get Cypress 9 that has a different UI but similar setup. So there's an article in there about just testing Vue components and some of the custom stuff you might have to do to get your setup happening. So I wrote that before I worked at Cypress based on what I did at my previous job, and mentioned in there like some of the particular gotchas you might have if you're using Vuetify, for example, which is, you need to set up the context for your app to render in. And if your app depends on CSS that comes from a library, you do a little bit of work to make those styles actually be available. But it's not too much different to the way you have to set up your app itself.
Well, awesome. And I guess like just one last question here, and I can call it a day or a night here. Do you have resources for people who aren't using Vue, maybe just regular JavaScript as well as React?
Yes.
Are there other places that you can source those to?
So our docs are super good. And let's just kind of start out. So there's general testing guides here, and there is component testing specific stuff for React and Vue, which is the initial like pair that are officially supported. There's some community stuff that gets Angular working if people are doing Angular and want component tests, and there's all sorts of plans for Svelte, and we do have support coming for Next and Nuxt as well. So kind of wanting to capture the major frameworks and the meta frameworks that people are using. But in the absence of that, you can write a custom mount command that will do kind of whatever you want to attach your component to the page. So my expectation is as more people use this, the community will probably get ahead of the implementation in supporting like, whatever the framework of the week is, and having popular frameworks have custom mount commands. It's not super difficult to add those. So the general documentation page has a good set of links on the left that if component testing or end-to-end testing is interesting, people can learn about it there. Can also learn about, testing strategies and see specific guides. If anybody's used Cypress before, we did just make a major improvement that came out a little while ago, which is the ability to visit multiple domains in a single test. And that used to be a real pain point because that was not supported, and it meant like logging in through a third-party authentication system directly in the browser was not supported. You would need to programmatically log in. That was sometimes a stumbling block for writing end-to-end test. It's still like better time-wise if you do log in programmatically if your system supports it, But if you need to have the user click through in an end-to-end test, go to a different website, log in, and get redirected back, that whole flow is now supported. So I would say getting started with Cypress actually internally at a company is a much lower bar now than it might have been a month ago before that feature was released. It's easier to get further in a spike, for example, without having to deal with auth upfront on your first day.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think this is a good spot to just kind of wind down. So I think basically, if anyone has any last lingering questions, feel free to ask now. Or I guess if not, what's the best way to reach you, Mark?
So I'm pretty attentive to Twitter. Let me put that in the Slack as well. Just to generally chat. I'm also like really interested in hearing people's like specific situations and use cases as this is rolling out. It's a huge coincidence, the timing of this, because I offered like several different topics. I don't tend to present about Cypress specifically. I tend to talk about accessibility or front end process. So most of my like existing talks that I've done are not Cypress specific. But I do obviously like talking about this component testing stuff as well. So if anybody does want to follow up and share a particular experience, or if you try it and you hit roadblocks and stuff, I'd be happy to learn about what those are by trying to help you get around them. So like, please do reach out. And especially probably in a couple of weeks, I should have some time opening up to be able to communicate about it.
Awesome. Well, I definitely will take you up on that offer.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well done. Great presentation. And thank you to everybody who came today. This was a great night. We'll say, I think, we'll go ahead and post this to YouTube. I'll try to get this up as quick as I can. I know there were more people who wanted to come, but I think I may have accidentally locked the talk.
I saw some people. I tried to admit them as they were coming in. Maybe that worked. Not sure, but that's fine. Yeah.
But yeah, for sure. Next time we'll make sure that we just keep the registration open the entire time. But that said, it'll be up on YouTube shortly. Feel free to comment there and reach out to me if you ever want to like learn more of this stuff in depth. Do some kind of like work on GitHub with me or like team hack. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn. I'm Vijay Menon, and as well as feel free to reach out to anyone else you see here, including Mark. And thank you again. Thanks a lot for this meetup tonight.
Thanks so much. This was great. Appreciate it.
All right. See you all. See you all next meetup.